Hello and welcome to today's SGIA webinar, Walking Working Surfaces, an Overview. This is part one of a three-part series that's being co-presented by Printing Industries of America and SGIA, and we're glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Dan Marks. I'm SGIA's Director of Content Development, and I'll be the moderator for today's program. For those of you who are with us, welcome. And we have two great speakers today who are going to really be setting the stage for the Walking Working Surfaces world that will be presented over the next three programs. So if you'd like to flip that slide here. We have two presenters, both from Printing Industries of America. First is Matthew Crownover. Matthew, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As Dan said, my name is Matthew Crownover. I'm an EHS specialist here at Printing Industries of America, located in Pittsburgh. We're glad to have everybody on board. I focus a lot on the OSHA side of things for our team here in Pittsburgh. So I'll pass it over to Caitlin, and she can introduce herself as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am also an EHS specialist at PIA. There is a little cohort of three of us in the Environmental Health and Safety Department. As Matthew said, his focus is more on the OSHA side. Mine is more on the environmental side. So we balance each other out very well, and we're all very excited for you all to be here with us today.
That's great. We're excited to have both of you with us today to share your knowledge of this topic and hopefully to give business owners the information they need to both stay in compliance and keep their employees safe. So with that, let's get started with the presentation.
Okay, so just to go over some general housekeeping items here before we jump into the presentation. You may have noticed all of you are muted currently. If you have a question or comment, you can use the submit question box on the right side of the screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. The webcast is being recorded, and the recording will be available to you along with a copy of the slides. You'll receive that information in a follow-up email. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to go through some of today's agenda. Just very briefly, as mentioned, this is the overview of the new Walking Working Surfaces regulation. So we're going to go through an introduction, go through some of the rule changes, some general requirements under the new regulation. We're going to touch on ladders, protection from fall hazards, dangerous equipment, holes, the training requirements that are part of the new standard, and also the periodic inspections that have come along with that new standard. So for a bit of an introduction, one thing that's important to know is that slip, trips, and falls cause the majority of general industry accidents. They also account for 15% of all accidental deaths in general industry. So that's something that the printing industry falls under. It also causes more fatalities than all other causes except for motor vehicle. So people often don't think of slip, trips, and falls as being that as hazardous as potentially machine guarding, lockout, tagout, those types of things, where in actuality, slip, trips, and falls are one of the leading causes of accidents and fatalities, not just in the printing industry, but in general industry. OSHA's standard for walking working surfaces applies to all permanent places of employment. And on this slide, you can see how OSHA defines that. They define it as any horizontal or vertical surface on or through which an employee walks, works, or gains access to a work area or workplace location. So to kind of parse that down, essentially, the standard applies to any surface that your employees are going to be on, walking through, or getting on top of during their job duties. So as you may know, the revised rule became effective January 17th of 2017. Training on walking working surfaces, which we will touch on later in the presentation, was required as of May 17th. And coming up, there is another requirement, that certification of anchorages. So you need to make sure that you're aware of that, and by November 20th, all of those anchor points need to be certified. The revised standard also set the requirements for fixed and portable ladders, fall protection systems, floor, aisles, ladders, dock boards. Essentially, any walking working surface is going to be covered under this. It also set training on fall hazards and fall protection systems. It outlined design, performance, and use of fall protection systems. And it also detailed the inspection process for the surfaces that people are working on, the equipment they're using, and ladders. So for all walking working surfaces, employers need to ensure a number of things. So this is any walking working surface that an employee is going to be accessing, using, working on. You need to ensure as the employer that it's clean, orderly, dry, and sanitary conditions. So you need to make sure that any spills, anything like that is being cleaned up, being removed from that surface so that you're providing a clean surface for them to work on. It needs to be maintained free of hazards. You also need to ensure that that walking working surface can support the load that's being placed on it. So a great example of this is in a lot of facilities, they have mezzanine storage areas. So that mezzanine, you need to ensure that the load that's being placed onto the mezzanine can be supported by the structure. The employer also needs to ensure that there's safe access and egress from that area where the employee is working. That means, as we're going to touch on shortly, that passageways need to be unblocked, that they have safe egress from there in case of an emergency. Employers are also required to conduct periodic inspections, maintenance, and repair. However, the standard did not define the frequency at which the inspections need to occur. It also did not specify the documentation that's required for those inspections. So in that situation, we always like to say that if you didn't document it, there's no way to prove that it happened. So although documentation is not required per the way the regulation is written, documentation is always beneficial for you to have. That way, if there's an inspection, you can pull that documentation up and you can show that you were inspecting those walking working surfaces at a set frequency and you were documenting the process. So as I touched on briefly, you need to keep clear and move obstructions that could create hazards in aisles and passageways. This is something we see a lot within our industry, blocked exit paths. The top photo there is a great example of keeping the exit path clear. However, unfortunately, a lot of times we see facilities where that's not the case and that product has been either placed or strayed into those pathways. So you need to make sure that those exit paths and doorways are accessible and are not being blocked. If you have permanent aisles and passageways, you should be marking those on the floor. That can be done with paint, striping. You need to make sure that those are being clearly marked as aisles and passageways. If you're going to have mechanical handling equipment, so forklifts, pallet jacks, traveling through an aisle, you need to make sure that there's sufficient clearance within the aisle. So again, something that we see a lot of is constricted aisleways because there's product piled up on each side. You need to make sure that that's wide enough that your forklift operators, your pallet jack operators have room to maneuver the product that they are trying to move through the area, and that they have access to pick up the product and safely remove it from that area. So stairways, the regulation applies to all permanent stairs. So any stairs that are permanently installed, this is basically going to be anything besides a stairway that would be on wheels that you can remove from the area. We do see those that would not fall under this because they are not permanent stairs. The rule defines stairs as a riser and treads. As you can see in the photo here, the riser is going to be that vertical section, and the tread is going to be your horizontal section. There needs to be uniform. It needs to be uniform between the landings. So you don't want stairs that are varying in height, not only because it would be difficult for somebody to climb, but also because it is going to create a hazard in case of an emergency. So you want to make sure that the stairs that you have are uniform. They need to be able to support at least 5 times the normal anticipated live load, but no less than 1,000 pounds at any point. So if the stairs are only for people going up and down, your minimum threshold is 1,000 pounds. But if there's going to be more material moving up and down those stairs than 5 times whatever that weight is, and that's more than 1,000 pounds, you need to make sure that you're meeting that 5 times the normal anticipated live load. So that's something that you need to take into consideration. What's being taken up and down those stairs, what product's being moved that way, and you need to make sure that you are providing stairs that can support that load. So ladders is a big section of this new standard. All ladders, whether they be portable, mobile, or fixed ladders, need to be inspected. So they need to be inspected before the initial use on each work shift, similar to the inspections on forklifts. So before that shift starts, they need to be inspected to make sure that they're not damaged, that there's no warping, they're in plumb essentially. Make sure that they're going to be safe for your employees to work with. This wasn't covered under the previous standard. However, with the new standard, it is a requirement. Ladders that have been designed into a piece of equipment, however, are not covered. So an example of this would be ladders on a press that's designed into it, or the ramps that go up and over certain equipment, that these are not going to be covered under this, so they would not need that inspection element. For fixed ladders that are 24 feet or more above the lower level, they need to have fall protection. New ladders put in after November of 2018 cannot have cages or wells. If you have existing fixed ladders, you need to ensure that they are retrofitted with proper fall protection by November of 2036. So you may think that you have a long time on that one, and so it's about 18 years, but it is something to keep in mind that those fixed ladders that you have at your facility do need to be retrofitted with the proper fall protection. So they no longer want cages or wells, they want fall protection similar to what you can see in the photo here, where there's an anchor point that people can attach to while they're ascending and descending the ladder. Another important part of that is the 24 feet or more above a lower level. So if there's a break in the ladder and there's a platform, that's now resetting that distance. So you need to make sure that it's not the total distance that's traveled going up the side of a wall or wherever it may be. It's the distance above that lower level where that ladder begins. So another thing that was covered under the new standard is protection from fall hazards. If you have an unprotected side or edge of a elevated platform that's 4 feet or more above a lower level, it needs to be protected by one of the following. You can install a guardrail system, you can install a safety net system, or use personal fall protection. That's up to you. The new rule eliminates the use of guardrails as the primary fall protection method. So you're still allowed to use guardrails, but you can also use the safety nets or personal fall protection. One thing to keep in mind is that if one of those systems isn't going to be feasible or it's going to create a greater hazard by putting it in place, you should develop a new fall protection plan and implement that rather than using that dangerous and hazard creating system. So guardrails. Guardrails are something that oftentimes are installed incorrectly. They don't meet the standards. There are a number of standards of rules to consider when you're installing a guardrail system. The first being that the top edge height of the top rail needs to be 42 inches plus or minus 3 inches above the walking working surface. So that is going to be the top of your guardrail system. It needs to be 42, essentially 39 to 45 inches. If there's not a wall or parapet that is at least 21 inches in height, then you have to meet one of the following again. So you have those three options. You can install mid rails at a height midway between the top edge of the guardrail system and the walking working surface. You can also install screens and mesh going from the walking working surface up to that top rail. You can also install intermediate vertical members such as balusters that are no more than 19 inches apart. So on the next slide, we have examples of each one of those. The guardrail systems also are required to withstand a force of at least 200 pounds. So that's the minimum. They need to be able to withstand 200 pounds of force being applied to that guardrail without it damaging or collapsing. They're also required to be smooth surfaced. And another thing to consider is that the ends of the top rails and mid rail sections are allowed to overhang the terminal post as long as they don't pose a projection hazard. And I'll show you an example of that on the next slide as well. So these are those three options that you have if there's more than a 21-inch gap. So as you can see in the photos here, if you look at the photo on the right, the top of that guardrail down to the walking working surface is greater than 21 inches, which means you're required to either have the mid rails, the screen or mesh, or the balusters. So all of these are examples of when that parapet is not decreasing the distance between it and the top rail by less than 21 inches. So these are your three options. You can install any of them depending on the situation that you have. If you look at the photo on the left with the multiple mid rails, you can see what I was talking about as far as the allowance of overhang on the terminal post. So on the guardrail closest to you in the photo, the top rail is overhanging that bottom post, which is allowed under the standard as long as it doesn't present a hazard for people working in that area. So if it's projecting out too far and you have the potential for people to run into it, be knocked off balance by it, be impaled by it, you need to make sure that that's terminating at that end post. So in this example, it's not creating any hazard, so it's okay to have that overhang there. Another thing that the regulation touched on was open side walkways and platforms. Open side walkways and platforms, again, if they're 4 feet or more above the floor adjacent to it, then they need to have a guardrail system in place. They also are required to have a toe board if there's any potential for falling objects off of that surface. So in the top photo, you can see the toe board circled there. So that's an elevated work surface where there's a potential for product, tools, anything essentially to fall off of that elevated surface onto the people working below it. So in that situation, you are required to install that toe board. Guardrail systems on ramps and runways should be installed along each unprotected side or edge. So in that bottom photo, you see both the guardrails on the outside and the inside edge of that ramp. That is required under the standard. So you can't install just one side of the guardrail. You need to have both sides protected by that guardrail system. So a little bit more information about toe boards and protection from falling objects. So the toe boards have a number of requirements for them as well as the guardrail systems. They need to be, as I mentioned, they need to be put in along the exposed edge of the overhead walking and working surface. So if you have an elevated platform, a great example again is mezzanine areas where there's an elevated work surface from the ground floor. If there's going to be people working up there with tools, any equipment, if there's product being stored there that has a potential to fall off and injure the people working at the lower level, then you need to have those toe boards in place. They need to have a minimum vertical height of 3.5 inches. Unless they're being used around vehicle repair, service, or assembly pits, then the minimum is only 2.5 inches. You also need to consider that they can have no more than a 1/4 inch clearance or opening above the walking working surface. So in this photo here on the side, you can see that the toe board goes the entire way down to that walking working surface, but you are allowed to have a gap in between the walking working surface and the toe board as long as it's less than that 1/4 inch. That way it's still protecting from objects going in between the toe board and the surface and still falling off of the edge. They have to be solid or without openings that exceed 1 inch. So they can be graded as long as those openings are less than 1 inch. This is, again, to prevent small objects from falling through those openings and landing on the people below. They also have to be capable of withstanding a force of at least 50 pounds being exerted on them. So continuing the protection from falling objects, as mentioned before, when there's tools, equipment, or materials, you need to have some sort of protection from falling objects. If they're piled higher than the top of the toe board, so if you install that smaller toe board here that has a minimum vertical height of 3.5 inches, but you're storing materials or equipment or tools above that toe board, then you need to install paneling or screening, not just the toe board. So as you can see in the photo on this slide, there is a mesh screen there that goes from the walking working surface up to that top rail. So it's covering that from product falling above that 3.5 inch toe board. The openings in the guardrail system need to be small enough to prevent objects from falling through. So if you're working with large objects, you can have larger openings. However, if you're working with small hand tools, small parts, you want something similar to this where the openings are small. You can't have product falling through them. Canopies used for falling object protection need to be strong enough to prevent collapse and penetration from falling materials. So this would be if you install a canopy below that elevated surface. So basically a safety net that's going to catch any product falling from the elevated surface before it can land on the surface below. You need to make sure that those are strong enough to protect against any of the product that would be falling. So if you're storing large product, it needs to be more robust. And if it's small product or tools, it doesn't need to be quite as robust. It can be a little bit weaker. So another thing to consider is some facilities have hoist areas. So examples of these are overhead storage, access to panels and floors. So if you have a floor that opens up and you can lower things or raise things from an area below, then this is something that you need to consider. Employees are required to have to be protected from fall of 4 feet or more to a lower level. Again, you can use a guardrail system, a personal fall arrest system, or a travel restraint system. This will be touched on in more detail in one of our upcoming webinars in this series. However, the difference between the personal fall arrest system and the travel restraint system is the travel restraint is working to prevent them from going over the edge. So it's essentially limiting the area that they can access. So whereas the personal fall arrest system is exactly as it sounds, it's a fall arrest system. So it's designed to save them once they begin to fall rather than the travel restraint protecting them from being able to fall off the edge in the first place. When employees are not performing hoisting operations or removal guardrail section with the top rail, mid rail, and toe board needs to be placed across the access opening. So in the photo that we have here, it's a mezzanine area. So there's a guardrail going across that has an opening for product to be put up onto that mezzanine. So what is in this picture is a swing gate that can be opened for moving and storing product up there, and then closed when there's nobody performing hoisting operations. So you need to have that capability to close that off entirely when people aren't actively working with it. So dangerous equipment, if people are working on elevated surface above dangerous equipment, there's two different sets of requirements. The first one is if they're less than 4 feet above the dangerous equipment, then they need to be protected by a guardrail system or travel restraint system, unless the equipment below them is guarded or covered to eliminate the hazard. So if you have people working on an elevated platform that's less than that 4 feet cutoff, then you only are required to have a guardrail system or travel restraint system to prevent them from falling onto that equipment, that dangerous equipment. You do not need that, again, if the equipment is guarded or covered in a way that eliminates the hazard from if they fall on it, they're no longer in danger. So essentially you're eliminating that hazard. So since it's under 4 feet, you're not required to have any of those systems in place. However, if you're more than 4 feet above dangerous equipment, you have to be protected by either the guardrail system, a safety net system, travel restraint system, or personal fall arrest system. So this is similar to any situation where somebody's working 4 feet or more above the surface below them. And now I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin. She's going to take you through the next couple of sections.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Okay, so now we are on holes. And this part has gotten a little bit better since they revised the regulations. Previously, there were 4 openings and 4 holes, and you had to know what the measurements were and all that. So they streamlined it a little bit. A hole is now a gap or any opening that is at least 2 inches wide in its least dimension. Okay, now this includes skylights also. So for holes that are 4 feet or more above a lower level, you have to have some form of wall protection. So you can have covers, but they have to support 2 times the weight of any employee, piece of equipment, or material that will be placed on that working surface at any given time. Or you can also use a guardrail system that also must withhold an employee or any of those other things. Or you can have the travel restraint or the fall arrest system. So again, they are pushing you towards, you have to have this fall protection, but they give you a couple different ways in order to meet that requirement, which is nice. So for holes that are less than 4 feet, you just need to cover it with a cover or a guardrail system. And the reason we emphasized skylights is a lot of times people don't think skylights as a hole because they have a cover. Okay, the problem with this is those covers are not meant to hold a human being. And we have had instances where people have fallen through skylights doing roof work and they have died. So, and companies have been cited for that. Because even if they're a contractor, you can still be responsible for that accident. OSHA dictates the hazards presented, who contributed to the hazard, who didn't fix the hazard, that sort of thing. It gets a little complicated, but if you have these skylights, make sure that someone can't injure themselves. Okay, hang on here. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties moving. Matthew, you might have to progress for me.
Yeah. Here, try it again.
if it's not working.
All right.
Okay, I'll go ahead and advance.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so for those guardrails, they have to be installed on all of those unprotected sides of that hole. Otherwise, it's not doing much good. So for ladderways that have holes or platform openings, they also have to be guarded by a guardrail system or a tow board that Matthew went through earlier. Now for hatchways and chutes, so if you have a ladder that goes up to your roof in the middle of a building, for example, you have to protect that also. So again, it gives you multiple options to comply with that standard. You can use the hinged floor hole cover, a removable guardrail system, or just a guardrail system and a travel restraint. As you see in our picture there to the right, that hatch has a self-closing gate. So the employee will come up through, it's protected on all sides, they come through it, and then it'll close behind them. Okay. So our next section is pits. We don't have that many pits in printing, but you may have one. So if you do, this is a section you'll want to pay attention to. So OSHA is fond of sometimes giving exemptions, but only if you do it the way they want you to. Okay, so pits kind of fall under that. Fall protection is not required for pits as long as you follow these 4 things. So the first one is you want to limit the access to the pit to authorized employees, and those are identified as trained employees. So you've gone through the fall protection, the walking working surface training that we'll get to towards the end, and so they are educated employees in and around this hazardous area. So we'll also need to have floor markings, creating a 6-foot line. And we want that to be in a nice contrasting color so it's very visible to an individual. So pretty much what that does is the authorized people are allowed to be within that 6-foot barrier, but everyone else is not allowed to cross that line. Okay? So that warning line has to have be able to resist a force of 16 pounds applied horizontally. Okay? So make sure that barrier it can at least hold 16 pounds. And then we need to have a sign, because we love to have signs, and it's going to say caution open pit. Okay, so we need the markings, we need the restraint, and we need the sign, and all of those to deter those employees that should not be in that area. So our next section is dock boards. So some dock boards, this would not apply to. So this is for any dock board that has a runoff hazard. So some dock boards, they have an elevated loading area. Okay, so if that's above 4 feet, you'll need to have fall protection. I have been to some places where they just load right onto the pavement right outside. There is no fall hazard whatsoever. Okay, so if you do have a fall hazard and a runoff hazard, then you're going to need fall protection, and you're going to have the dock boards with the runoff protection. So you see in our picture below that yellow piece, that's going to prevent any of the equipment from accidentally going off the side and getting stuck or whatever it may be. Okay. Also, if you have the raised floating dock, if you have the panels that it makes the loading door smaller so that it's just the size of the truck, that is also acceptable. So that prevents that hazard from presenting itself. Okay, so the only exception is when you're using your forklift equipment that is 10 feet or less above the lower level. Okay, wheel chalking is very important. Unfortunately, we don't see this very often when we go on our audits. So anytime you have moving equipment, you have a semi-truck or a loading van or something backing into your loading area and parking, you need to chalk the wheels. Okay, it's a very simple thing, but I don't see it all that often. You can also have a dock lock, is also very common, but the issue with dock locks is they may be there, but people may not necessarily be using them. So that's just something you want to make sure your employees understand the importance of dock locks and wheel chocks, because you really don't want to be loading a semi-truck on a forklift and then all of a sudden it starts moving away from you. Okay, so personal fall protection systems. So this is one of the sections that will be covered in the last installment of our webinar series, but we're just going to go over some of the basics in this webinar. So obviously they need to be inspected before each use and during each work shift. And you need to check for wear, damage, and any really form of deterioration that would cause that piece of equipment to fail. And you need to cover how to inspect these items with your employees during their walking working services and fall protection training. So you need to make sure that the ropes and belts and harnesses, any pieces of those fall arrest systems are compatible with the connectors. And you need to have a method for a rescue in the event that equipment does fail. We need to try as much as we can to avoid those things from happening, but we still have to be prepared in case, God forbid, that would actually happen. So we need to make sure that the attach point is located in the correct spot of the employee's back. So as you can see, our gentleman to the right, it's right there square in the middle of his shoulder blades and his upper back. So employees may need to adjust it depending on their height. Okay, and there are technical requirements for strength and D-rings, pretty much anything that's going to hold that employee up. And so not necessarily their fall arrest system itself, but maybe like their anchor point, like if they're on the roof where they need to hook up to, because their fall arrest system isn't going to do them any good if that anchor point just snaps off. Just a little side note to mention, don't let your employees anchor to a railing. That's not what they're made for. Unfortunately, people do it very frequently. That is going to fail. It's not its intended purpose, and it probably won't be able to hold a human being and that tension force when that person starts to fall. Okay, so now we have positioning systems. They just have to be able to stand a drop test of, so we're going to drop 4 feet, but it's going to be a 250-pound weight is going to be the force dropping. So it just needs to be able to do that without failing. So it's pretty much the weight of a human being. So as long as you can demonstrate that drop test, and we always recommend documenting, because it's a little difficult to argue with OSHA that you did something if you can't prove that you did it. Okay, especially if that fails, then they're going to come to you and ask why you didn't do that drop test. Okay, so now we have low-sloped roofs. Okay, and this is going to be similar to the pits, but the rules are slightly more complicated. Okay, so a roof has a slope less than or equal to a ratio of 4:12. So that's really not all that important. What's really important is you have a roof and you are legally required to protect your employees that are doing work on that roof and your contractors as well, okay? So if you're doing work within 6 feet of the roof's edge, you have to have fall protection, have to have some form of fall protection. And as you can see, you can use one of the 4 general ones that we've been covering. We just want to emphasize that you aren't pigeonholed into one way of doing this, because we know people that have looked into putting up a guardrail system around their roof, and it can cost a lot of money. So that may not be the most feasible solution for you. So one of these other options may be more economical for you. So for work that is performed between 16 and 15 feet from the roof's edge, you don't necessarily need fall protection, okay? So you're required to use fall protection unless it is infrequent and temporary, okay? So that's going to be caveat number one. So if it's infrequent, like you just need to go do something like once a year or something like that, something goes wrong and you just need to check it, it's not a normal maintenance sort of thing, this would qualify. But then you also have to have a designated area. And there are things that go along with that. So this is our exception to the rule, but you have to do it the way that OSHA wants you to. Okay, so for a designated area, you must have a warning line of some kind that closes off that work area. Okay, so we're limiting the employees that are allowed to be there. It has to have a minimum braking strength of 200 pounds and no more than 34 to 39 inches at its lowest point. So it can't be that low that someone can go over the side of it. And it must be clearly visible from 25 feet away. So for work that is performed 15 feet or more from the roof edge, you again are required to use fall protection unless it's that infrequent and temporary work. If it does fall in that infrequent and temporary work, you can establish a work rule that prohibits employees from going within 15 feet of that roof edge. And if they do, then they need the fall protection or be qualified to be in that designated area, that sort of thing. So if you don't have anything within 15 feet of your roof, then any work you do, just institute a work order and your problem is solved. But it might be a little bit more complicated if you're within those other ranges. Okay, so our next thing is training. Training is very important, as we all know, and there are a lot of things that need to be covered. But the first hurdle you have to cover is that employees must be trained by a qualified person. So OSHA uses qualified person and competent person, but those are not the same thing, okay? A competent person can be someone that has experience or previous training. So for example, forklift training, you don't necessarily have to have any special certification. You can train if you use a forklift, if you've been given training by another competent person, and then you can therefore train other people on forklifts. This is not the case for walking working surfaces of fall protection training, okay? So must be a qualified individual. They must have some kind of certification or degree of some sort in order to comprehend all of these specifications. It's very technical. It can be very complicated. So that's why they wanted a qualified person. But you need to train them on the fall arrest systems, the nature of fall hazards and how to recognize them. It's very difficult to explain to employees hazards. They might walk past a hazard every day and not realize it actually is one. So that one might take some conditioning of your employees. They need to understand procedures to minimize hazards and procedures to install, inspect, operate, disassemble all of their protection. They also need to know how to care for it, inspect it, and store it. Very similar to the requirements for personal protective equipment. So if you're wearing safety glasses or nitrile gloves for chemicals, that sort of thing. They also need to be trained on ladders and ladder safety systems. So that's things like having 3 points of contact at all times, how to properly ascend and descend, not to carry something up the ladder with you that will make you unstable and possible to fall, that sort of thing. Also, the functions of portable guardrails, those designated areas for that infrequent rooftop work that we just discussed, proper dock board placement, and proper rigging for rope descent systems if that's required. And you don't have to train on all of these things if you don't need them. So really what you need to do is assess each walking and working surface area that you have, determine what kind of equipment you need for those areas. So if you need fall protection, then you will need to provide training to those employees that will be using that fall protection. So this is an overall list. Some of it may not apply to you depending on your operation. And they must retrain if an employee fails to understand what they have been giving training on previously. So if they're doing something wrong, if you see a harness wasn't inspected correctly, if a ladder wasn't inspected correctly, they need to go through that training again. Much like the forklift training, if there's an accident or a near miss, they're supposed to go through the training again. And if you have any changes in your workplace that makes the training inadequate. So I was talking about you may not have all of these systems that you may need to cover, but maybe you change something in your process and then one of those new things becomes required. So you haven't trained them previously, so then you would need to provide that additional training. Okay, so the last section we're going to cover is the periodic inspections. So as Matthew mentioned in the beginning, this is a new requirement for the walking and working surface standard. And it's kind of daunting from an admin standpoint. So it is applicable to all work areas, even offices, okay? You may not have that many hazards present, but you need to make sure that you're inspecting all of your work areas. It must be conducted frequently and as necessary. That's the definition that OSHA has given us, which of course is very gray. Our suggestion is to do it at least once a month, and you must document what workplace you've evaluated, the names of the individuals completing the evaluation, certifying the evaluation, and the date of the hazard assessment. So the places you might want to cover, you're going to cover any general working areas, aisles and walkways, stairways, loading docks, roofs, any elevated surface whatsoever, because you may need fall protection for those. Fits and holes, and outdoor conditions also count, okay? Many people think that outside their building is irrelevant. OSHA doesn't really care. But when someone gets hurt in the parking lot and it's considered an OSHA injury, then it matters, okay? So for those of you that live in cold states like we do in PA, you get ice, it messes with the concrete, breaks it up, splits it, creates different surfaces, creates trip hazards. Those are things you will want to make sure you identify, okay? And check after winter's over, check to see if any of your concrete slabs have shifted or created any holes or things like that. I'm a klutz. I trip on carpets. So if I'm gonna see a piece of concrete that shifted up, I'm definitely going to hit it. So that's just something to make sure that you cover. But that is our walking and working surface webinar. We have checklists available for our members to help you comply with this new regulation. There's a lot of new stuff in it, and we know it can be very overwhelming. So these checklists are to help you assess your areas, determine if you need fall protection, what is required of you. From a compliance standpoint, we have one for the periodic inspections, and we have ones for ladders as well. So those are tools for you guys to help comply with this new regulation and ease the burden a little bit of this new rule. So just to let you know of some upcoming events that we have. Like Matthew had mentioned in the beginning, this is a series of webinars. So we have ladders will be the next section presented by our lovely Gary Jones, and that will be on June 14th. And then Matthew will be presenting our fall protection webinar on June 21st. So those are going to be, we covered those on the surface level in this webinar, but they're going to take a much deeper dive in those sections. later next month. So we also wanted to highlight our program, the Safety Shield. So this is a designation that is part of the Best Workplaces in America recognition program. So we started this last year, and if you're familiar with the Best Workplace, it covers a lot of HR-related items. We added a safety section to it as well, and it covers items that may be best practices as well as actual compliance requirements. So it's a really good tool. It's a virtual compliance assessment for your company, essentially. We'll look at your written programs and give you feedback on those items, and it's a really great tool if you're looking for some guidance. So the Safety Shield is optional. You don't have to do the Safety Shield, but in order to do the Safety Shield, you do have to participate in the Best Workplaces program. So,
okay.
But yeah, that's it. To questions.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks, Caitlin and Matthew, for the presentation. We do have a number of questions available. While we're on this slide, I will jump out and say, obviously, Caitlin and Matthew are the go-to people here at PIA. If you are an SGIA member or you're more closely connected to SGIA, Marcy Kinter of the SGIA staff is the person to reach out to. So we do have several questions, so let's jump into these. First, is it a requirement to document annual training for ladder safety?
No. But we always recommend documenting. So ladder inspections that each work shift inspection that you need to do, you're required to do it, but you don't have to document it. So it's sort of a catch-22. You don't have to document it, but then how are you going to prove that you did it if OSHA came in? Because what they're going to do is do observations. And if someone's improperly using a ladder, they're going to say that you didn't complete that training. So we always require to document training. If you're going to do it, you might as well document it. All you need is a sign-in sheet with names.
Yep. Okay. This is a very specific question, but I will present it here. The person says, our mezzanine has a removable gate that has to be lifted out of its slot and moved to the side. If the company does not want to get the appropriate gate, then would they need a harness system in place to remove and replace the gate?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
Yeah.
In that situation where employees are manually picking up and removing that gate,
Mm-hmm.
as Caitlin mentioned on one of the previous slides, you are now, once that gate is removed, they are now within that 6 feet that requires them to be wearing fall protection. So by the regulation, they would be required to have fall protection on to remove that gate.
Okay. And what it
that can be a fall arrest system.
What if it was like a sliding gate? Same thing, as long as it's open?
Yeah, so in the case of the sliding gate, you can make an argument that if they are off to the side of the opening where the gate is still going to be in place,
Mm-hmm.
then they are still being protected by that gate. Now, if they're in front of where the gate's been moved away, there's now an opening there.
Right.
So that is a very tricky situation, and unfortunately, there's no specific text in the regulation that addresses that, but based on our interpretation, yes, specifically for the example where they're lifting up the gate, they're removing it while standing at that opening, they would require either a travel restraint system that would keep them from going over the edge or a fall arrest system.
Okay.
I'd also like to add something there. So like Matthew said, if they're off to the side where the railing is still protecting them, that you could make an argument that would be fine. But in reality, they're probably not going to do that. Unless you're going to sit there and watch that employee do it the way you want them to, they're probably going to need a fall arrest system.
Right, and the removal of the gate is for a purpose, generally to pass something through that opening.
Yes.
It's not just for fun, right? Okay, next question. Do I need to inspect the sidewalks, parking lot, roof, all that kind of stuff as part of the new requirement?
Yes. Um, you don't necessarily have to inspect it all the time,
Hmm.
but that's why we created the different types of checklists. So we have an overall walking working surface compliance checklist where you are evaluating your areas based on the new regulations. So your roof may fall under there. You'll decide whether or not you need to create a designated area or a work rule to not pass that 15-foot barrier. But the walking areas, hazards, trip areas, yes, you need
Okay,
to make sure that you are including those in your periodic inspections.
yeah. And even if it's just a flat deck, the parking lot is just a flat deck of asphalt, at least you looked at it, considered it,
Hmm.
and marked it off on the checklist, correct?
Yes, because things can change, conditions can change.
Right.
We all hate potholes every winter, but they pop up out of nowhere. One day they're there, and one day they're not. So it's just to make sure that that is a consistent condition and that something hasn't changed since the last time you looked.
Okay, next question. The person says, I have a press deck that is more than 4 feet above the floor. Do I need to provide a railing on the machine?
In that case,
If
yes.
it doesn't have one, yes.
Okay, I mean, I know a lot of the big presses I see have those already installed and
Yeah,
probably
most of them
good.
do. Yes.
That
But
said
sometimes we
again,
have old equipment that doesn't come
also,
with what feature.
and it's not uncommon for machine guarding to be removed for sake of
Exactly.
convenience.
Yeah,
Exactly.
another
Or
thing to
just not have it
consider
at all.
Yeah,
another
Matt.
thing you want to consider with that is since they're working on that press deck, a lot of times you have tools, you have product going up and down.
Yeah,
You need to have that toe board that's going to prevent items from falling off. It
yeah.
may seem like, oh well, it's barely over 4 feet. It's not going to fall onto anyone's head below it, but the requirement is if it's above that 4 feet, you need to have that toe board if there's product there.
Great. Thank you for that addition. How frequent do I need to be inspecting my work areas?
Our recommendation is every 30 days. You can do it more often than that if you wish. We would just air caution if you don't want to do it every month. Because like I had mentioned previously, OSHA did not really give us a definition of how frequently it needs to be. It just says frequent and necessary. So essentially what they'll do is they'll come in, and if there is a trip hazard in a walking area, they're going to tell you that you haven't been completing your inspections as necessary.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a tricky one, but our suggestion is at least once a month. And especially if you're changing equipment out frequently, I know in printing we move stuff around a lot.
Yep.
So if you're doing that frequently, every time you move equipment around, it would probably be a great idea to conduct one of your periodic inspections.
Okay. All right. Going back to some descriptions of the low slope roof, somebody was asking if a flat roof is also considered a low slope roof.
No, so that comes down to that ratio, that 4 to 12
Hmm.
between the vertical and horizontal. So you'll just want to inspect your roof, go up and look at it, and see if you fall in that low slope category.
Right, and it's less than a ratio of 4 to 12 or more than.
I think it's equal to or more than.
Okay, got it. All right. And then there was, let me see, the next question related to scaffolding. Does this fall under the 4 foot rule? This person says it used to be 10 feet to the next surface. Can you expand on that?
They do address scaffolding in the walking working surfaces rule.
Hmm.
The standard, the general standard used to be 6 feet for everything, and then they've lowered it to 4 feet. So scaffolding does fall in this. So I think they lowered it from 10 feet. So you will need fall protection if you're using scaffolding.
Okay. Or a railing?
Yes.
Very good. And you mentioned the checklists. Is there Where can people get these checklists? Are they available to the public? Can you describe that?
Yes. So we have them located on our PIA website. If you go to our OSHA compliance section on our landing page, our EHS landing page, there's a walking work services page, and it has all the articles that we've written. It has all of the compliance checklists. I believe Marcy also has them as well. So if SGIA members wanted to get a hold of her, she would be able to pass that along.
Sure. And
so we compiled these together, so they're the same. So if you're getting them from PIA or you're getting them from SGIA, they'll be the same.
Okay, very good. Before we wrap it up, do either of you have anything additional you'd like to add?
Nope, I just want to thank everyone for joining this webinar with us, and we hope to see you on the ladders and fall protection webinars as well.
All right, Matthew?
No, I don't have anything to add at this point. I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Caitlin said, and we hope that you'll join us in the next 2 sections of our webinar series as well, where we'll go into a little bit more detail on both the ladders and the fall protection systems.
All right. Well, thank you for both of you for the presentation today. It was illuminating, and I learned some stuff, and I hope all the rest of you did as well. So this marks the end of today's program. We'll see you online again soon. And remember, June 14th, ladders, and June 21st, fall protection. We'll see you there.